I'd like to welcome everybody once again to our 234th episode and the first one in our spring series of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. We're joined by David Trauba, our Wildlife Section Manager today. So David, thank you for joining us today and talking about this. It's a big year, 75 years of WMAs, the Wildlife Management Areas across the state of Minnesota. So looking forward to hearing about your presentation.
Hey, thank you, Benji. Yeah, glad to be here today and very happy to kick off the spring webinar series. So yeah, it's a big year, big celebration for us. We got 75 years of our wildlife management area system, and you're going to hear me say WMA, but again, that stands for our state wildlife management areas administered by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. So if you look at the title, it's Saving Wetlands and Shaping a Legacy. And that's really what we're going to talk about is how do we build collectively, our partnerships build the wildlife management area system we have today. As Benji mentioned, I'm the wildlife section manager. So it's my, if you will, honor and privilege to oversee our wildlife section as a whole. Been with the agency for 34 years. Seems like my first day was yesterday. But time moves fast. And I was 24 years out in the field office, landed at Lac Wildlife Management Area in the upper Minnesota River Valley. Lots of prairie, lots of wetlands, loved every minute of it. Spent 9 years as the regional wildlife manager in the southwest part of the state, overseeing, again, that part of the work area. Really enjoyed it. Looking at all the great work our staff are doing across that southwest part of the state. So when the opportunity came on to take on, if you will, the wildlife section manager role, I really didn't hesitate. I was just the ability to be able to work across the state and deal with things from prairie grouse to ducks to elk and moose and everything in between was quite the honor. So more of a background, I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. I did grow up in Wisconsin. Go Packers, got to get that jab in here to start the day. But one of those people where I kind of knew I wanted to be a wildlife person, if you will, from a very early age. Went on to Stevens Point, got my bachelor's degree there, then jumped on, stayed on, and finished up my master's degree. And my work was on blackberry ecology up in the Apostle Island National Lakeshore on Stockton Island. Spent 3 years there, then a year up in Ely with the Forest Service, working on blackberry ecology. My dream job was to be a forest wildlife manager. And then my wife said, we're really poor to get a real job. And that brought me full circle to landing that first job at Lac So that's my background. The outline for today is we're going to talk about the different land classifications we have. Again, I'm going to kind of compare and contrast a WMA from a state forest, just kind of give you that background and grounding, because a lot of people are, what is a wildlife management area? Then we're going to dive in kind of pre-settlement conditions in Minnesota and how things rapidly changed, and that's what really spurred the Save the Wetlands program, which is the precursor to our WMA. And I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive and then into the evolution of our WMA system. So enough talk, we'll get on with where we're at. So I do want to talk about, like I said, I'm calling it Introducing the Outdoor Recreation Act. Now, obviously, we had state forests and state parks prior to 1975, but the Outdoor Recreation Act in that year, 1975, really created the official land system for how we manage our state lands. And then every recreation unit has a law, right? That's a statute that says what it is about, what is its purpose, and what you can do on those lands. So we'll just quickly walk through what a state park, state forest, scientific natural is, and compare and contrast to a wildlife management area. So if you look at our state parks, that's our Parks and Trails division, right? And I'm not going to go and read everything on the left-hand side, you know, how many parks we got, how many miles and stuff. You folks can do that on here. But really what state parks are about, we're protecting, if you will, the scenic beauty of Minnesota, the natural heritage of the state of Minnesota. And it's real heavily emphasis, excuse me, is on outdoor education, right? And then obviously any of the camping facilities and stuff are allowed, are encouraged, but they cannot, if you will, distract from the original intent, and that is capturing a snapshot of the natural beauty, the natural heritage that we have of that state park system. And there's a goal to have a state park in all 87 counties in Minnesota. If we go on then, talking a little about our state forests, obviously they are administered by our forestry division. And there's over 5 million acres of state forest land. About 2.5 million acres of them are school trust lands. And what are school trust lands? That came out of, basically was formed in statehood. And those school trust lands, any of the revenue generated, be it from minerals, from timber, goes into the permanent school trust fund account. And that helps fund K through 12 education throughout Minnesota. So those 2.5 million acres, again, that are administered by forestry provide the revenue for our schools, which a lot of people didn't realize. But you have timber management, woodland stewardship, forest conservation easements, and then obviously, our forestry division does our wildfire response in the state. But really, when you look at state forest lands, they tend to be open to more multiple use, right? Outdoor or motorized vehicle travel is allowed more often, maybe compared to some of our other land units. That's just one example. Then if we look at our ecological and water resource division, they're really broke into, you got your ecosystem management, some acronyms there. SNAs mean scientific and natural areas. You also have your invasive species branch. You got your non-game wildlife, which is very well known, right? You got your tax check off for the non-game program, but you got your rare resources. CBS stands for the County Biological Survey. Then NHS is the Natural Heritage Information System. So forgive me on the acronyms, but it's really the science branch. I look at the County Biological Survey, just that. They went to every county in Minnesota saying where are the rare features, where do the intact landscapes still exist? And then actually within wildlife, we use that information when we're out looking at acquiring lands. So, but if you look at public land, you can see there's about 166 scientific and natural areas for around 192,000 acres. And that data is a year or two old, so the numbers may have changed just a little bit. But when I think of scientific and natural areas, that's really meant to protect the best of the best native prairie that's out there, the best forest lands that are out there. And it's for scientific and educational purpose. Really, that's where a lot of the science takes place. How do these systems operate? And so when I think of SNAs, they're trying to save the best of the best that we still have here in the state of Minnesota. Now we transition to the Fish and Wildlife Division. That's where I reside in. Our mission is to manage, conserve, and enhance the state's wildlife, fishes, and the habitats they depend upon. Outdoor recreation is certainly important. We're broken into two sections. You got the sections of fishery, and you have the section of wildlife. And we're going to talk about the evolution. We started at 0 acres, and today we're talking that we got around 1,500 WMAs across the landscape, covering over 1.4 million acres of land. And then on the other hand, we have aquatic management areas are really set up to protect the water resources, to protect the water quality. And there we have 700 what we call AMAs or aquatic management areas for 46,000 acres. And I have mentioned a pill payment. A lot of times we'll hear from people, well, you don't pay taxes on your lands. And yes, we do. We pay what we call payment in lieu of taxes. So we do, if you will, the state of Minnesota pays taxes that goes to the counties, and the counties disperse it out accordingly to a formula. But diving in a little bit deeper on what is a WMA and how it really sets it apart, and I'm going to have to put my glasses on, and forgive me, you should do this in the slideshow, but I'm just going to read the first one. A state wildlife management area shall be established to protect those lands and waters which have a high potential for wildlife production, and to develop and manage these lands and waters for the production of wildlife, for public hunting, fishing, and trapping, and for other compatible recreational uses. And now you can go on and read further down on it. But I think what sets a wildlife management area different from a state park, state scientific or natural area is that it is acquired for wildlife conservation purposes to protect those habitats that wildlife depends upon, to do the restoration and enhancement work to make sure that wildlife thrive. And I always tell people it's really about building that legacy for future generations. So now let's take a little bit of a journey back through time and look at what we had on Minnesota's landscape and what really prompted the Save the Minnesota Wetlands program, saving wetlands, shaping a legacy. So we'll take that deep dive now. And does have a little bit of a prairie focus. Obviously, I spent most of my career in the prairie, but the Save the Wetlands did originate, in that area. So at one time, Minnesota was the Serengeti of North America. And we think of Serengeti, right? That's a term that we use in Africa. But I just want the listeners to realize that was Minnesota at one time, bar none. Our ability to produce migratory waterfowl was probably the best there was in the world, right here in Minnesota. Now we think of prairie waterfowl, you think of Canada and stuff, but it was right here in Minnesota. The western part of the state was 18 million acres of grass, grass and water, grass and water. You had herds of bison moving up and down those grasslands. You had elk pretty much throughout the state, except for the far northeast into the boreal forest. And when you look at the predator-prey dynamics back then, you had the prairie wolf hunting large animals. So like I always told school groups back in the day, when you look at that type of landscape, you had phenomenal nest success because you didn't have many predators on the prairie. So when people talk about waterfowl darkening in the skies or passenger pigeons, it was because at one time Minnesota was the Serengeti of North America. But things changed, right? As European settlement, I always tell people the prairies fell first. The prairies were the first to go. And you talk about the original horsepower. When they were breaking the prairie with horses, the settlers would write about it sounded like shotguns going off just because that thick fibrous root system that the prairies have. Again, most of the tall grass prairie, the biomass exists below ground. You're only seeing a very small portion above ground. And it's interesting when the first people came across, they didn't think prairies were good for crop production because they couldn't grow if you can't grow a tree, it can't be good for growing a crop. Well, we know that was wrong, right? Our prairies, and the reason why they're so endangered, holds the best soils and now today provides the best cropland. But by probably by the early 1900s, most of the prairie in Minnesota was gone. And another thing I tell people is that prairies are never safe. Now, back in the days where we were converting prairies to cropland using horses, they got what I'll call the best prairie, the best mesic prairie. No rocks, not too many wetlands where they could work around them. The ones that were easy to convert. So most of the prairie and most of our wildlife habitat today is on areas that are either too rocky to farm or too wet to farm or it's something. The best soils that are required to grow for growing wildlife, quite frankly, are mostly in agricultural production. But anyways, when I say prairies are never safe, is that lack of parle. I watched too many prairies fall to the plow, if you will. The rocks were jerked out, and then a few years later, that area was cropped. But the good news is we work real hard with lots of partners, lots of partnerships, and we saved a lot of prairie as well. And I think today, when you go to that upper Minnesota River landscape, most of the native prairie that remains is protected. So that's a conservation success story. I just wish we could have done it sooner when there was more prairie to be had. So now if you look at current conditions, again, the Serengeti of Minnesota was gone really by the early 1900s. So that map on the left, you don't see a lot of color there. That red is where the native prairie remains. Now, again, there's more grasslands out there through CREP, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, the Conservation Reserve Program, right? So there is more grass in that western part of Minnesota than this graph is showing. This is highlighting the native prairie. So basically 18 million acres to less than 2%. Maybe we have 150 to 200,000 acres today. In really a geological sense, a blink of time. And it took 10 years for a township to be quote unquote tamed, right? And a township is 36 square miles. So again, the prairies fell first, and then the next to disappear were our wetlands. And again, I don't have it on here, but we're talking grass and water. I mean, this was Minnesota had a lot of wetland density. The prairie pottles, it's called the prairie pottle region for a reason. And really, they fell not only to agricultural drainage, right, but also to build our towns, to build our roads, and stuff. So, but it was state and national policy to convert wetlands to farmland. At the turn of the century, you had the state drainage system, you had state drainage law, and then even within our agency, you had the Division of Drainage and Waters. So it was policy to go out, federal and state policy, to convert as many wetlands to agricultural land as possible. And here is a map that I was able to get from Greg Hope showing a drainage map prepared by the Department of Census and Bureau from the 1920s. And you can see Minnesota on the map, actually northwest Iowa, that's the prairie pothole region of Iowa. And then you can see all the black on the western part of Minnesota. That was the prairie pothole region of Minnesota at the time. So you can see by the 1920s, the number of drainage projects. And that only increased when World War II came on. There was even further drainage activity. And then you started getting even machinery was getting bigger. The drag lines had more horsepower. So we started seeing wetlands disappearing at a very rapid rate. Now, when you look at really the precursor, back then we were known as the Minnesota Conservation Department. And in the 1930s, I think the best I can tell, we probably had 3 what I'll call game managers for the entire state. And they all resided here where I'm sitting today in St. Paul. So Dr. Paul Highby, he was the project lead and the federal aid coordinator. And I'll talk about federal aid in a little bit. But he had that position in 1946. But anyways, in 1948, he oversaw the transition to what we call the area game manager system. And that is really where we have people out in the field and they have a geographic area they cover, or a number of counties. So you can see here, we had 9 game management areas. Then later we expanded that to 12 game management areas. And then Dr. Erickson and Dave Trauba, they were 2 of the pre-World War II biologists, hired what we call the first 12 game managers, and they put them in the western part of the state. And some of them were known as Arnie's Army or Arnie's 12 Apostles of Game Management, if you will. And on the right-hand side, the photo you see there is Jerry Bew. I had the pleasure of meeting Jerry. I think he was in 92 at a land dedication. His family dedicated what we call the Beautiful Acre WMA down in Lincoln County. And I had the pleasure of meeting him. But here's what the 12 game managers really did. They sounded the alarm. Wetlands were being drained at that time at a rate of 3 to 5% per year. And that black color you see in the photo here are wetlands that are being drained from a piece of farmland here in southern Minnesota. And when I talked to Jerry at the land dedication, he said, Dave, it was incredible. He said we would go up and do aerial surveys. And back then they actually counted the number of muskrat huts on the wetlands. And he said next year we'd go by and the entire lake, the entire wetland would be drained. And it became so much where he really left state service, because he just could not tolerate looking at that tremendous loss of habitat on the landscape. So those game managers, now today we call them wildlife managers, really were sounding the alarm. And if you look at what we call the 10-mile creek job, that's in Lackawanna County, that one project alone drained 573 wetlands for nearly 6,000 acres of land. That was, if you will, reduced waterfall population just in that small project. We figured by 5,000, over 10,000 muskrats, and a tremendously large number of pheasants and other waterfowl species. So these people are watching the habitat disappear very rapidly. They had agreements with the soil conservation districts. They would know of all the different drainage projects going on in the county. And then it was up to the game managers. They would literally go out and knock on the door and saying, hey, Joe, I see you're looking at draining, all the wetlands on your property. How about that 40 acre? How about we just, set that aside? It's needed for water quality. It's, ducks and muskrats. You like to hunt ducks, right? So they were doing their best they can to kind of work at a person's land ethic. But obviously, when it came to the financial end, just a lot of them like, yeah, I can't do it. I need to send my kids to college, right? And there's nothing, I don't want anyone to take my talk today to be a ding on the agriculture community. Great people. They're doing what they need to do to survive. And really, it's the Farm Bill that is encouraging this. And back then, it was state and federal agencies encouraging the conversion of wetlands to cropland. So they were doing what they were told to do, right? But good people. So, that's a tough job for a wildlife person. I did the same thing when I was at Lac Pearl. I would go up to the people that were taking the rocks out of the prairie and knock on the backhoe and say, hey, George, this happens 12,000 years old, right? It's really important for wildlife. It's, you try to tell everything that's neat about a prairie. That's like, yeah, Dave, I get it, but I can make more money growing corn, right? So the bottom line is that the game manager, we said, if we're going to save wetlands, we're going to need to go out and acquire them. So that's really what started the Save the Wetlands program, the idea of it. Now, this individual here really lit the candle and led the crusade. And I want everyone to know the name Richard J. Doerr, because he is so instrumental in the history, not only of the visionary behind the Save the Minnesota Wetlands and our WMA system today, but he was also instrumental in the, Richard J. Doerr Memorial State Hardwood Forest down in the southeast part of the state. The reason we have a state forest in that state is because of his efforts. But anyways, Richard, he was a military veteran. He attended the West Point Military Academy. He was a decorated World War I veteran. He is captain, awarded the Silver Star, 2 French War Crosses, and received the Purple Heart. And interestingly, and this talk is still under production, if you will, because I'm trying to dig even more into the history for the individuals that were really instrumental. And there's probably more I can learn on Richard here. But what I find, he kind of, I'll use the word disappeared a little bit after World War I. I don't have a good record. He was probably clearing, I like to think he was probably just trying to clear his mind, because he saw a lot of things in World War I that I don't think we can even imagine. But anyways, what I found interesting, he joined the conservation department at the age of 48 years of age, at 48. And he became the supervisor of the Bureau of Game. So I got that. And when I go back, there was some other of the original game managers said, yeah, he wasn't the best biologist. And I think what it was, I don't think he really had a biological training. I think his college was at West Point. I'm not sure what kind of natural resource program he had. But what he did have, and he probably got this through military training, he was a visionary. He was relentless. He was a great speaker, philosopher, And I used the word, he had a great capacity for outrage of environmental sins. And he was an author. He had 2 books that he wrote, the Ghost Tree That Speaks and The Old Rail Fence. So he was an author. If you want to look up those books, you certainly can. And I already talked about the state forest. But really, he was, when people went to his talks, they said they came away as an emotional experience. So he was really able to sway a crowd. And it was his perseverance. Take no, don't take no for an answer is really why we have our WMA system today. And then laying the legal foundation. So you had, Richard out there just being an advocate, being a visionary. Then you had Ray Hayek. He was an assistant attorney general for the Minnesota Department of Conservation, right? So there's a legal branch for us. But Ray was so instrumental that he helped establish the legal concepts around public waters. Again, back then, that didn't exist. And the public trust doctrine that would support water and wetland protections throughout the state. And that legal framework that Ray and others helped shape really recognize and we still use to defend our public water and our environmental interests that we have in the state today. And he was described, and I'm looking here at my notes, a little frail Lebanese attorney. So we use lots of colorful words to describe people back in the day. I'd probably get fired if I said, hey, my coworker is such and such, but that was how some people described Ray. But whatever, he was really stood tall in the conservation world. And he also served as 2 years as the national president for the Isaac Walton League. So now if we dig into a little more of the foundation behind Save Minnesota's wetland program, it was launched officially in 1951, hence the 75th anniversary by the Minnesota Conservation Department. And its goal was to protect disappearing wetlands. And back then we had a goal of 250,000 acres. That was our goal. And we had a lot of detractors. There were people within our agencies that said, yeah, you can't do it. You're not going to get people to sell you their land. It's not enough acres. It's this, that, or not. But Ray, Richard, and others just let that fall off their back or off their back. They kept at it. That you can see the little buttons, Save Our Minnesota Wetlands. I contributed. Those buttons were being sold for $1 by different sportsmen's club. I have it, the North Shore. I got to put my glasses on. The North Shore Game and Fish Club of Long Lake really took on, selling those pins. And I think they sold around 9,000 some dollars. Again, going into that account to help us buy and purchase wetlands. You also see some of that money was matched by what we call the Pittman-Robertson Fund. That's the federal act of 1937, excise tax on firearms and ammunition. So just put it this way, if the state of Minnesota spends $100 on wildlife habitat work, we get reimbursed $75 from the federal government. And that is, to this day, one of the hallmark pieces of legislation that allows us to manage our WMA system and really helps our game and fish fund budget. But that's a talk for another day. The first acquisition took 2 years, 1953 in Lincoln County, the Cavermo WMA. And you can see the headstone, I shouldn't say the headstone, the dedication monument for that WMA. And that was a celebration site during our 50th anniversary of our WMA system. In 1957, the legislature approved $1 surcharge on your small game license to go towards land acquisition, a whole $1. And really this program started the federal program, the Waterfall Production Area program on the federal side of the fence, and it really had nationwide interest. So the evolution of the program and the expansion. So in 1971, obviously we realized we had rising land prices, cost more to do business. Drainage was still occurring, right? You had the actually there was another spurt of drainage in the 1970s as cropping techniques changed. And the legislature allowed us to put $2 surcharge on the small game license. And that was around $550,000 that we could use towards WMA acquisition. In 1975, we had the Resource 2000 program, and that was stated a goal of 1 million acres by the year 2000. And you can see, and where I look back at that is that when you had those planning documents and you set goals, that's really what required. And it might seem like, oh, that's far away, we can never get there. Put it down in writing and you work towards it and you can meet your goals. So that's really what the Resource 2000 project was about in my mind. In 1981, thanks to that Resource 2000, again, that planning document, the legislature appropriated $4.5 million for the 1981-83 biennium, and they also increased surcharge and small game licenses to $4. Again, to help fund our WMA acquisition program. And during that year, during that tenure, it started moving away from just saving the wetlands, but we're also starting to purchase forest land, brushlands and stuff that our wildlife managers deemed as being critical for wildlife throughout the state. That photo here, I want to just acknowledge that's Roger Holmes on the left-hand side. In the photo, Roger was our division director for many, many years. He was a great guy and passionate. And then on the right-hand side is Joe Dugan, just really a conservation giant as well within Pheasants Forever. And we'll talk about, or if I don't, we do our work in partnership. So WMA program's expanding. And then if you really look at in 2001, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary of our WMA system. And then at that time, we're up to 1.1 million acres of land. So that's one of the best and largest in the country. And that made up 1,355 WMAs across 86 of Minnesota's 87 counties. If I look at the Save the Wetlands program, duck hunters were instrumental, but the other one, the big one we're going to be talking about here just in a little bit, was in 2005. Folks might remember we had the Rally for Ducks and Wetlands and Clean Water at the state capitol. 6,000 people showed up in the steps of the state capitol. I was one of them saying, hey, we need to dedicate money towards acquiring land throughout the state. We need, we're still losing wetlands, etc. Right? So there was people there saying, hey, we want to see a state sales tax that everyone pays into to support conservation throughout the state. And that happened in 2008 when we had the passage of the Legacy Amendment. That increased the sales tax by 3/8 of 1%. And that really began in 2009. Folks, if you're not familiar with it, there's 4 funds. You have the Outdoor Heritage Fund, the Clean Water Fund, the Parks and Trails Fund, and then you also have the Arts and Trails Fund. So we in Wildlife work with the Outdoor Heritage Fund. Just like any other agency or any other organization, we need to submit proposals in. But every year the Outdoor Heritage Council awards, I think it's around $160 million to support conservation throughout Minnesota. It has actually been a game changer, absolute game changer for our ability to protect, enhance, and restore wetlands, forests, brushlands throughout the state, not just us, but for all our other state agencies and partners. So I can't say about that, but it is that program that I really think took our WMA to the next level. I'm preparing for a duck summit this weekend, and since 2009, the Outdoor Heritage Fund has allowed our WMA system to grow by 75,000 acres. 75,000 acres of new WMA lands thanks to that funding source. Pretty much has doubled the amount of land that we can acquire compared to the old days where we had surcharge, bonding, or maybe a little bit of rim dollars available. So in 2026, we're here. We got the 75th anniversary, and I'm very proud to say we now have 1,500 WMAs across the state, encompassing 1.4 million acres of land. So again, back in 1951, someone said, we should save some wetlands, 250,000 acres, and look at where we're at today and stuff. So I always remind our staff, work doesn't end with us. When we retire, people come in behind us, they continue the good work we're doing. So just some closing thoughts. And, this one I talked about, caring for our land and our legacy. Our work is only a beginning. We are following in the footsteps of those before us. And I will always tell our staff we're following in our footsteps of some conservation giants, right? We got big shoes to fill. And really, when I look at the Save the Minnesota Wetlands program, it wasn't at first I thought, the real beauty, we saved that wetland. But what people reminded me, Richard Dewar and others, when you go through the history books, it wasn't about saving that wetland. It was really about changing state and national policy, how we viewed wetlands and how we viewed the environment. That's what the Save the Minnesota Wetland program was about. It was that ecological awakening within society that started saying, hey, there's values for these natural systems. We need to protect them. And being in this chair, I'm just thinking that's a story that we got to keep reminding folks that that's important today, that having natural areas, having clean water, healthy air is important. It's a part of who we are. It's an economic engine for the state of Minnesota. So that's really what this program was about. It was about changing our views of the natural environment. I love this quote by Richard Dewar. I think he penned that back in 1951. Conservation, thy name is controversy. Remember that. Do not allow yourself to be defeated. Don't become a cynic. If you lose one, get up and win another. I like that. He was also known for think big and write the first chapter first. And if you're interested, if you go to the Conservation Volunteer, I think there's an archive where you can go. Richard wrote a number of articles in the Conservation Volunteer. There are a number of other articles in the Conservation Volunteer that even does a little bit of a deeper dive into the Save the Minnesota Wetland program. Again, the precursor to our WMA system. And I like this last quote. Many of the game managers and others who helped make the program such a great success are no longer with us, but they are not forgotten. Their monuments are the wetlands they saved for posterity. And that was penned by Forrest Lee, and he was one of the original 12 game managers in the state of Minnesota. So I just got 2 slides, and I think we'll have time for questions. Here's one of the big ones. If you want to get a hold of us, sometimes people are like, hey, how do I get a hold of the Minnesota DNR? I'll just let this hover a little bit. I think maybe one of the easiest ways is go to info.dnr@state.mn.us. Someone will get back to you on your email. Hey, I got a question on this, or I need to find someone. If you were to navigate to our website, we have our office locator. And then finally, if you're interested on more on our WMA anniversary information, you can contact yours truly here at the number you see listed. I'd be happy to visit with folks. And when I give these talks, someone invariably comes up and says, Dave, I have more on Ray, or did you know about this about Richard? I want to hear that news. I want to get that information because this presentation, trust me, is a work in progress. And I think we need to do a deeper dive on the people. And then Angela R.S. Ward, she's part of the 75th anniversary team. So if you're wondering about what events we have coming up throughout the year, I would get a hold of Angela. Eventually, we're going to have that on our website. It's been a pleasure. Benji, I think I see you came on camera, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions folks may have.
Dave, this is such a good reminder of what a great state we actually live in. And I've lived out west and been traveled all over the place. And I will say it again, and people can argue with me if you want, but Minnesota is probably one of the best states, if not the best, in the country. We don't have BLM land here. We don't have mass amounts of federal land, but our WMA system, our public land access, our rivers and streams are some of the best in the country, maybe in the world. But it's such a cool place. So thank you for coming on and sharing the story about how this started. Your comment about following along. These people started back in the 50s, and we keep doing the good work, and it's vitally important, and it's vitally important that we keep up with this work. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, Benji. I mean, I'm reminded, in the 1950s, look at the challenges they had, right? I mean, and they rose to the occasion. We still have some of those same challenges today. There's still pressures on wetlands and grasslands, especially up, further to the west. You got climate change and stuff. And Ed Arndt with the Wildlife Society, he gave a talk, and he said, "You just got to be a stubborn optimist." And that really resides with me. I'm just a stubborn optimist. There's going to be a better tomorrow. And if we're not laying that foundation for a better tomorrow, who is? Right? So I think I think the work of our wildlife section, the work of the DNR is really building that foundation for a better tomorrow. And I'm with you, Benji. And, we go across the different states, and they all have their different things going on, but they look to Minnesota pretty envious of what we have, especially with the Legacy Amendment, building the WMA system, or just the public lands in general. So,
and that shouts out a huge shout out to all the citizens of Minnesota who have
yeah,
passed this on. My grandparents in the late 70s sold part of their farm to the Richard Dorr State Forest, so I grew
oh
up
really? Yeah,
running around the Richard Dorr State Forest, and it was citizens like my grandpa that said, yeah, this is we're saving. We're going to sell it to the state, make this a forever area, public land area where people can use. So, and we're still doing it today. So it's a shout out to all the citizens of Minnesota that have helped with this great work. So
yeah, absolutely. And I've spent my time in the southwest part of the state my entire career, and there are some areas where it's our public lands, or is virtually in some cases the only wildlife habitat available out there on that landscape. Now, obviously, as you move further north and west, you get different land types. You have more natural communities, but in some of those more, areas where you had the best soils, our WMAs are really providing just that critical home for wildlife. And then when you get the good farm bill with a good conservation title, then obviously you really build upon that. So
yeah. Well, we got a
yeah,
couple of questions that have come
yeah,
in here. So if you want to stop your slideshow, you're more than welcome to. And again, this will be on a recording. And somebody asked me about giving a link to the recording. So maybe Cassie, if you want to put our archive link in the chat there, there's a couple other links in the chat there. You can do that. That would be awesome. The first question we have is regarding the PILT payments, the PILT payments. Is the payment in lieu of taxes, right? Payment,
yep.
the rate the state pays to counties the same as the federal PILT rate, or is it a different amount? Do you know?
No, it's a different amount. The federal PILT rate, their revenue is different. So it's not the same rate. It's based on, for first few years, it's based on the I'm going to get the percentage, I think maybe mixed up with the Heritage Fund, but I think it's like 0.75% of the appraised value for the first 5 years. And then after that, whenever the county assessor updates the rates, then we pay off the county assessor's rate. So I can say in my tenure in the Southwest, when the state would acquire lands, our pill payments were greater than what they were in private ownership. Again, just by the price. Now, as that gets to the further part, as you get into the northern part of the state, that formula changes just a little bit. But I would encourage anyone, if you got questions like that, if you go on to our DNR website, right, mndnr.gov, navigate to, I think it's public lands or your public lands, it'll break down the entire history of, school trust lands. And then it does a deep dive into our pill payment formulas. Great source for information.
Great. It's a great Moss topic. We might have to have somebody from the school trust lands come on, because that is really a unique program too, and how we help fund some of the schools. So one more question. Do you foresee DNR being able to maintain the current pace of new acquisitions? Land prices have risen sharply, as we know, and so my concern is where this will lead in the future for new public lands.
I think we will. There's greater demand right now than we can handle. And I'll back up just a little bit. We kept track of this because it was like, oh, you're buying everything that comes to you. So we started in a very formal way keeping track, and people that call our office willing to sell in our land. And on average, 85 to 90% of the people that contact our office willing to sell our land, we're like, nope, we're not interested. Again, they're like, well, where are you at? We bring up a map. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry. There's really not, restorable wetlands on. There's no native prairie. There's no CRP, and it's, 5 miles away from the nearest public land. Appreciate it. You might want to talk to the Soil and Water Conservation District for other options. So I just want people to know the vast majority of landowners that come to us saying, hey, are you interested? We say no, it doesn't meet our strategic needs. Our acquisitions go through at least 5 different reviews. The first review is at the area office, regional office. We look at it here in St. Paul. Then it goes through our strategic land asset management group. So our lands we are bringing in, we are being strategic. We're not just buying it willy-nilly. They got to be of a certain size. The first one has to be over 160 acres. Pretty much they need to be, adjacent within a cluster of other public lands. I'll stop there. I just want people to know we're being strategic and where we're acquiring lands. But I think across the regions, interest is high in selling land. And I think for a few reasons. Right now, we're going to have a generational shift in the agricultural community. A lot of the farmers are in their 50s and 60s. They're looking at how passing on their legacy. Some of them want to see that legacy of that land going back into conservation. Some of them can remember where they were duck hunting on these sloughs, etc. So we have that going on. And it always is ebbs and flows. So yeah, I do think we're going to be able to continue to grow our WMA system, but we got to keep educating everyone, county officials. It's about relationships. We do our work in partnerships, but it's about forming relationships, making sure we're talking to our county boards or state legislatures and letting them know the importance of the public lands, how we fit into the local communities, because we are part of the local communities. So it's got that education that always has to take place.
It's an important part of everything we do, that's for sure. So I got a question in. Somebody was watching your slide real close. He said in 2001, all but one county was represented. Which one didn't have land set aside? And do all counties now have a conservation area in it? So test for what you remember, Dave.
Yeah. I'll admit I got that off I think an article that Kim Hennings wrote. He was our acquisition coordinator. I don't have the answer for that. If I had a guess, I would say Cook County, but I could be wrong on that. That's a good Trivial Pursuit question.
There we go. We'll have to put that in the next staff Trivial Pursuit deal.
Yeah.
Do all the counties have public land now? I want to say all of them were represented at some point, had some WMA or aquatic management area in it.
Well, certainly I think public lands, and I think now we have a WMA in all 87 counties.
Okay. So how does the Minnesota DNR consider promotion of non-game species compared to game species in the management of wildlife management units?
I think equal. I'll be honest with you. Maybe you heard me today focus or talk more about the game species, but non-game and those rare species are critically important. I would when you really look back at the first wildlife, they're out there buying land that had rare species. Um, prairie grouse. We have prairie grouse today in the state, and because of us acquiring those lands, right? That prairie grouse needed to survive. And I think of the east central Minnesota and the sharp-tailed grouse range. So our work is tremendously critical to rare species and the non-game species. It's all about habitat, and that's what our Fish and Wildlife Division does. We put habitat back on the ground, and that's for all species, game and non-game. I don't like those terms necessarily. Take habitat, but that tends to be when we thought of game species. Yeah, I think back in the day there was more of that focus, but that's really a term we don't use anymore. So it's about putting habitat back in the landscape and then doing the correct restorations to meet the highest ecological standards. And with the Out There Heritage Fund, it's lights out. We are doing things today as far as our plant diversities, our forest regeneration work, our wetland development work that I never dreamed possible when I started my career. And all species are benefiting by that work.
I think that's the key. When some species can't live without other species, game or non-game, they all live in the ecosystem together and they all benefit and support each other somehow. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
the key
Yep.
is the habitat piece of that. We're building habitat for all of it and go from there. So I think I got one more that just popped in here. Well, somebody was paying attention. They said they believe it was Hennepin or Ramsey County in 2001 that did not have any. So somebody was digging into the trivia already. So we appreciate your help out there. I think with that, Dave, I think that was the last question. So I really appreciate the history and learning about some of this stuff and the 75 anniversary. It's an amazing program. Provides just amazing opportunities for all the citizens of Minnesota, and we really appreciate the work you done, and obviously everybody before us that have contributed to this program. So thank you very much for sharing your passion with us today.
Well, thank you, Benji, and yeah, appreciate the time today.
You bet. I think everybody, hopefully you can come back and join us. Turkey season, Dave, you might have some fun with turkey season, I think, right? You're a turkey hunter?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah, that's not
It's,
far away now.
it's coming up fast. So episode 235 in 2 weeks,
Yeah.
we'll be talking about wild turkeys in Minnesota. It's a great species that has been reintroduced here and doing incredible. So Greg Henderson is going to join us, talk about turkeys in Minnesota, and he's an avid hunter also. So he's going to talk about getting out there and hopefully bagging yourself a bird. So hope everybody has a safe and enjoyable week. Get outside, bring somebody new outside, enjoy the outdoors, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. So thanks everyone.